The official report of the judgment was presented to him during the same day. The perusal of this document was a subject of fresh grief for him. Legal forms had not been respected. The irregularities and the omissions which he noticed in it caused him to order it to be rewritten. Although the first consul had never doubted that the Duc d'Enghien would be condemned, he must have left the sentence to the discretion of the court-martial. If, as had been said, he had ordered a condemnation, the court-martial would, without fail, have been instructed in advance of the formalities prescribed by law, formalities which the president, the judges, and even the captain reporter himself appeared to ignore. It may be said that this judgment was that of a drumhead court-martial. This is another reason for regretting that the president of the commission did not think himself authorized to forward the request for an audience which the Duc d'Enghien had written at the foot of his examination. If General Hulin had had sufficient strength of character to resist the remarks which he alleges were made to him, and had followed the inspirations of his conscience, he would have done himself the greatest possible honor, and he would have preserved the first consul from the redoubling of hostilities of which this act became the pretext. For it can easily be guessed what Napoleon would have done under the circumstances. These are the only facts which I witnessed. I relate only what I saw or heard. I may add that no verbal or written communication took place between the first consul and the military commission during the time which elapsed between the examination of the Duc d'Enghien, which preceded his sentence, and the moment of execution. The means which I had of being informed on this point, and the investigations of those who had an interest in discovering any communication of this kind, totally failed to establish its existence. If I may speak of my private impressions, I do not hesitate to say that the first consul, justly incensed by the odious plots which were hatched against his person, wished to hurl back on his enemies the thunderbolts which they had launched at his head, and to answer war with war. Was he to allow himself to be quietly murdered without defending himself? He appeared to me never to have doubted for a single moment that the assembly of exiles on the Rhine had a prince of the House of Bourbon for chief, that this chief was the Duc d'Enghien, that the Duc d'Enghien's mission was to enter France after the blow had been struck by George and his accomplices, and that this mission had developed upon the Duc d'Enghien after the Duc de Berry had been prevented from landing in Normandy by the presence at Dieppe of an active and determined officer who was entirely devoted to the first consul. Under a deep and just sense of resentment, and clearly foreseeing the sinister future reserved to France and the bloody revolution which would have been the consequence of his death, he ordered the kidnapping and the trial of the Duc d'Enghien. Convinced as he was that sufficient charges to justify a condemnation existed against this prince, what struggles took place in Napoleon's mind are shown by the order given to Monsieur Riel to proceed to Vincennes and to interrogate the Duc d'Enghien, and by the solitude which he went to seek at La Malmaison, less for the purpose of strengthening his resolution than with the view of protecting himself against all outside influence, and of calmly reflecting upon his decision, avoiding Josephine's drawing room, locking himself up for hours together in his private apartments, and refusing to answer his wife, who frequently came and knocked in vain at his door. Although the reports received at La Malmaison, together with the letters seized on the exiles, left him no doubt whatever of the Duc d'Enghien's knowledge of the conspiracy, it is my conviction that, satisfied with the humiliation to which he had reduced his enemies, he would have leaned towards clemency if he had been informed in time of the request made by this prince to be brought before him. The evil having become one for which there was no remedy, Napoleon boldly accepted the entire responsibility of this act. He could not disavow the brave and faithful officers who had judged as their consciences had directed them to do. He refused even to enter into an explanation of the causes which had prevented Riel from reaching Vincennes in time. and these would have convinced nobody. His dignity refused to allow him to justify himself from the accusation of seeking to protect himself by false excuses, which would certainly have been brought against him. He therefore resolved to assume the entire responsibility of the affair. He prescribed the strictest secrecy on what had happened and allowed nobody to be compromised. He imposed silence on himself also, a silence which not even the most violent and the most persistent attacks could induce him to break. When one looks back to these critical times and reflects on the dangers with which the state was threatened, one is forced to admit that Napoleon fulfilled a painful destiny as head of the government, and that instead of charging him with a crime, one should rather pity him for having been placed in the necessity of accepting all the odium of an act, the deplorable consequences of which, in the future, his foresight only too clearly pointed out to him. The position of the sentenced man and the interested feeling of pity with which the hatred of the enemies of France suddenly covered the Duc d'Enghien have transformed an act of rigor which the most imperious circumstances imposed on the head of a government into a crime of savage ferocity. Napoleon found compensation for the embarrassments in which his enemies involved him in connection with this matter in the enthusiastic attachment of the people, excited to the highest degree by the imminence of a common danger and the vigorous measures by which it had been averted. But it is true that the first impression produced by this event on the upper classes was a very strong one. The principal and perhaps the only cause of this impression being the mystery and the precipitation with which the Duc d'Enghien had been seized, sentenced, and executed. It was only by reading the Moniteur that the ministers, functionaries, and persons attached to the first consul's household learned what happened. La Malmaison presented a sad spectacle that day. I can still remember the silence which reigned that evening in Madame Bonaparte's drawing room. The first consul stood with his back against the mantelpiece, whilst Madame de Fontaine read him some book, of which I have forgotten the name. Josephine, with a melancholy look and moist eyes, was seated at the far end of a couch. The persons in attendance, very few in number at that time, had withdrawn into the neighboring gallery, where they conversed in whispers on the topic which absorbed all others. Some people came from Paris, but, struck by the doleful appearance of the room, remained standing at the door. The first consul, anxious or preoccupied or listening attentive to what Madame de Fontaine was reading, did not appear to notice her presence. The Minister of Finance remained standing in the same place for a quarter of an hour without being spoken to by anybody. Not wishing to go away as he had come, he approached the first consul and asked him if he had any orders to give him. The consul made a negative gesture in reply. I think it useful and necessary to reproduce in this place the notes written in pencil by Napoleon on the margins of the work entitled History of Napoleon in 1815 by Monsieur Fleury de Chaboulon. This book contains a long passage referring to the arrest and trial of the Duc d'Enghien. I have copied these notes from the original without changing a word, and they are as follows. Napoleon did not trouble himself about the Duc d'Enghien, who had been justly tried and punished by a court-martial. Already in 1797, General Moreau, in his report to the Executive Directoire at the time of the 18th Fructidor, had complained of the intrigues in which this prince was engaged with Pichegru and his agents in the army from his residence in Offenburg. This prince had a part in Pichegru and George's conspiracy. He was, in consequence, arrested and condemned to death by the competent tribunal. There was only one irregularity, and that was his arrest in the country of Baden, 3 leagues from the French frontier. But Napoleon was the protector of the House of Baden, and he had ordered Colonel Caulaincourt, his aide-de-camp, to demand the Duke's extradition, whilst Ordnay was crossing the Rhine with 300 dragoons and arresting the prince and his agents in his house at Ettenheim. To the remark that the death of the Duc d'Enghien settled the question which was agitating France, etc., etc., the emperor answers, the Duc d'Enghien's well-merited death injured Napoleon in public opinion and was of no political use whatsoever to him. Answering the statement that Josephine, Queen Hortense, Cambacérès, and Berthier had implored him to save the prince's life, the emperor adds, that is false. The Duc d'Enghien, transferred to the castle of Vincennes, was tried and shot before anybody knew that he had been arrested. Besides, everybody at the time was so indignant at the well-known conduct of the Comte d'Artois, who was plotting murders in Paris, that there was a general expression of satisfaction at the news at the Tuileries and amongst the friends and relations of the ministers and of people interested in the state. It was asserted that the execution had been urged by Murat, who, prompted by a certain number of regicides, at the head of whom was Fouché, thought that he would be serving Napoleon, his family, and France by the death of a Bourbon. A note in Napoleon's writing denies this assertion. That is false. Napoleon knew that if the court-martial found him guilty, his execution would be proceeded to within 24 hours. I will add that the man who replied to the offer of the smugglers who undertook to hand over to him the princes of the former dynasty who were retired in England with the threat that he would have them hanged if a single hair fell from the heads of these princes, was not a man to consider the death of the Bourbons necessary to his fortune. In answer to the reproaches made against Monsieur de Talleyrand on this occasion, Napoleon writes, Prince Talleyrand behaved in these circumstances like a faithful minister, and the emperor never had to reproach him on the subject. If the affair of the Duc d'Enghien had to occur over again, the emperor would act in exactly the same way. The interests of France, the dignity of the crown, and the law of just reprisals forced him to act as he did. It is said in the passage in the book, which was annotated as above by the emperor, that the arrest of the Duc d'Enghien had been for a long time imputed, and was still imputed by persons who did not know the exact facts, to General Caulaincourt. On the margin is written in the emperor's writing. All this is absurd. Caulaincourt, Napoleon's aide-de-camp, obeyed and had to obey Talleyrand's order to proceed to Baden, and at the same time that Ordonez arrested the prince to demand his extradition, accompanying his demand with an apology for the violation of territory. Ordonez was forced to obey the order to cross the Rhine with 300 dragoons and to arrest the prince. The court-martial was forced to condemn him to death if he was found guilty. Thus, whether innocent or guilty, Caulaincourt and Ordonez had to obey. If he was guilty, the court-martial had to condemn him to death. If he had been innocent, it would have been the duty of his judges to acquit him, for no order may sway a judge's conscience. There is no doubt that had Caulaincourt been appointed to try the Duc d'Enghien, he would have declined the nomination, but that, charged with a diplomatic mission, he was forced to carry it out. All that is so simple that it is nonsense to find any fault. It is true also that the Bourbon party, having persisted in calumniating Caulaincourt for the small part he took in this affair, this circumstance was the origin of the favor into which he was taken by the emperor. The death of the Duc d'Enghien must be attributed to the Comte d'Artois, who directed and commanded from London the murder of Napoleon by Pichegru and by George, and who had appointed the Duc de Berry to enter France by Béziers and the Duc d'Enghien by Strasbourg after Napoleon's death. I have spoken of the part played by Talleyrand in the tragical end of the Duc d'Enghien. This is proved by a letter which he wrote to the first consul under the date of Ventose 17, year 7, corresponding to March 8th, 1804. I shall, in its place, relate that this former minister, after having removed all personal papers referring either to the death of the Duc d'Enghien or to the occurrences in Spain from the imperial archives in 1814, consigned them to the flames. The letter in question here escaped this fate, placed for a moment in a writing table together with all the documents which had been brought from the imperial archives. This letter had slipped behind the drawer of a writing table and had remained there in oblivion. It was not till long afterwards that it was found. I have read and reread the letter, which on a double sheet of foolscap paper is written throughout in Monsieur de Talleyrand's hand and signed by him. It will certainly be published one day. Messieurs Mollet and Thiers have read it. The person who owns it refused to allow any copy to be taken. I recognized it as soon as it was put in my hands, for I saw it at the time it was addressed to the first consul. Its contents, its substance, were to the effect that its author, Talleyrand, had reflected on the subject of the conversation which he had the honor of having with the general, which was the title given at that time to the first consul. That Frenchmen loved his rule, that they placed all their hopes in him, that if anything could disturb their confidence, it would be the fear lest he might play the part of a monk. That the leaders of the conspiracy which had just been found out were the men of Fructidor, that a Bourbon was at their head, and that the safety of the state demanded that all the conspirators without exception should be seized. In a final paragraph, Monsieur de Talleyrand added that the first consul's aide-de-camp, Caulaincourt, was prudent and devoted, and that he would carry out whatever orders might be given him in a proper manner and in accordance with the consul's wishes. This accusing letter appears to have been preserved for the express purpose of giving a striking denial to the assertions of Prince Talleyrand, who has frequently repeated since the emperor's fall that the condemnation of the Duc d'Enghien had been entirely disapproved of by him, whilst, on the contrary, he did all in his power to bring it about. This deplorable affair had a fatal influence on Napoleon's destiny. It became in the hands of his enemies, who, as a matter of fact, never on any occasion took any interest in the Bourbons, a weapon with which they served themselves with so much success against him, that those who had taken any part in the affair, being frightened of its consequences, did all in their power to throw off all responsibility in this compromising matter from their shoulders. Amongst those was the Duc de Vicence Caulaincourt. The reproach of having been mixed up in this catastrophe filled his life with bitterness. He could not foresee that the execution of the Duc d'Enghien would so speedily follow on his arrest. How many times has he not spoken to me of the disagreeable things which he had to suffer on account of this affair in his family relations, and of the difficulties he had to overcome for the very same reason after his arrival in St. Petersburg. His first care on taking possession of the French embassy in Russia had been to convince the Emperor Alexander, his ministers, and the Russian nobility that he had no part in this tragic occurrence. This was the subject of two following letters, which were written without the Emperor Napoleon's knowledge, and which were published in the Journal des Débats, the Journal of Debates, in 1814.